September 15, 1972. Port Authority Bus Terminal, Manhattan. 2:30 p.m. Frank Lucas watched his youngest brother, Vernon, step off the Greyhound bus from North Carolina, carrying everything he owned in a paper bag and a cardboard suitcase. Vernon was 19 years old, had never been north of Virginia, and had no idea that his big brother was about to make him one of the most wanted men in America. Frank wrapped his arms around Vernon and whispered, "Welcome to the family business, little brother." Within 6 months, Vernon would be running a multi-million-dollar distribution network. Within 2 years, he'd have a target on his back from every law enforcement agency on the East Coast. And within 5 years, he'd be facing life in federal prison because his brother loved him enough to destroy his life. But Vernon wasn't the first Lucas brother to learn that Frank's love came with a price, and he wouldn't be the last. Frank Lucas had built the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history, but he'd built it alone, trusting nobody, relying on his own intelligence and paranoia to stay invisible. By 1972, Frank was generating millions in revenue, but he was also carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. The stress was killing him. Frank couldn't delegate important decisions because he couldn't trust anyone outside his blood family. He couldn't expand operations because he couldn't find reliable managers. He couldn't even take a vacation because his entire organization depended on his personal oversight. Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he couldn't trust strangers, he'd build his empire with family. His brothers had grown up with the same poverty, the same hunger, the same understanding of what it meant to be powerless. They'd proven their loyalty through childhood hardships. They shared his blood, his history, his determination to never be poor again. What Frank didn't consider was that his brothers also shared his innocence before the criminal life corrupted it. And innocence, in Frank's world, was a death sentence. The Lucas family had 11 children growing up in Greensboro, North Carolina. Frank was the oldest son, followed by Freddie, David, Vernon, and Larry. They'd grown up picking tobacco, chopping wood, and watching their mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Frank had escaped to Harlem in 1946, but his brothers had stayed in Carolina, living simple lives, working honest jobs, staying out of trouble. Frank's first recruit was his brother Freddie. In 1970, Frank brought Freddie to New York and made him supervisor of street-level distribution. Freddie was reliable, hard-working, and completely unprepared for the violence that came with controlling drug corners in Harlem. 3 months after Freddie arrived, he was beaten unconscious by rival dealers who thought they could intimidate Frank by attacking his family. Frank's response was swift and brutal. The 3 men who hurt Freddie disappeared permanently. But the message was clear. Frank's brothers were targets simply because they were Frank's brothers. Freddie recovered from his injuries, but never recovered from the fear. He started drinking heavily, carrying multiple guns, and jumping at shadows. The kind, gentle man who'd arrived from Carolina became paranoid, violent, and unpredictable. Frank watched his brother's personality disintegrate under the pressure of criminal life. But Frank didn't pull Freddie out of the business. Instead, he brought in David. David Lucas was the intellectual of the family. He'd finished high school, worked as a bookkeeper, and had a mind for numbers and organization. Frank made David his financial manager, responsible for laundering money, managing accounts, and keeping track of the complex financial operations that kept Frank's empire running. David was perfect for the job, too perfect. Within months, David knew every detail of Frank's operation: bank accounts, supplier contacts, distribution networks, financial records. David became the most valuable target in Frank's organization and the most dangerous liability. Federal investigators quickly identified David as Frank's financial brain. They put him under constant surveillance, tapped his phones, monitored his bank accounts, and pressured him with threats of prosecution. David tried to handle the stress, but he wasn't built for the psychological warfare of criminal life. By 1972, David was having nervous breakdowns, panic attacks, and sleepless nights. He begged Frank to let him return to Carolina, to go back to his simple life as a bookkeeper. Frank refused. David knew too much. He was family, but he was also a security risk. Frank couldn't let him leave, and he couldn't let him stay. David was trapped in a life that was destroying him mentally and physically. That's when Frank made the decision to bring in Vernon and Larry, his youngest brothers. Vernon Lucas was 19 and Larry was 21 when Frank summoned them to New York in September 1972. Neither brother understood what Frank really did for a living. They knew he was successful, that he lived well, that he had money and influence. But they thought he was a legitimate businessman, maybe involved in real estate or entertainment. Frank sat his youngest brothers down in his apartment in Teaneck and explained the family business. Not the details, not the methods, just the basics. We move merchandise from overseas suppliers to American customers, Frank said. It's dangerous work, but it's profitable work. And I need family I can trust to help me manage operations. Vernon and Larry were excited. They'd grown up poor, watching Frank transform himself from a Carolina farm boy into a New York success story. Now Frank was offering them a chance to be part of that success, to escape poverty forever, to build something meaningful with their brother. They had no idea that Frank was signing their death warrants. Frank assigned Vernon to manage distribution in Brooklyn and Larry to handle operations in the Bronx. These weren't entry-level positions. These were major responsibilities in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Vernon and Larry went from picking tobacco to running drug networks, literally overnight. The brothers adapted quickly, too quickly. Within months, they were wearing expensive clothes, driving luxury cars, and living lifestyles that attracted attention from law enforcement. They were young, inexperienced, and making exactly the kind of mistakes that Frank had spent years learning to avoid. But Frank couldn't pull them out without destroying his operation. Vernon and Larry had become essential to the business. They were managing territories that generated millions in revenue. Removing them would create power vacuums that competitors would exploit. Frank was trapped by his own success and his brother's incompetence. December 1973. Vernon was arrested during a routine traffic stop in Brooklyn. Police found 2 kilos of heroin and $50,000 in cash in his trunk. Vernon, who'd been living the criminal life for barely a year, made every mistake possible during interrogation. He talked too much, volunteered information, and nearly implicated Frank in federal crimes. Frank used his connections to get the charges dismissed, but the arrest was a warning. Vernon was too visible, too careless, too vulnerable. He was putting the entire organization at risk. Frank should have sent him back to Carolina immediately. Instead, Frank gave him a promotion. The logic was twisted but understandable. Vernon had proven his loyalty by not talking during interrogation. He'd shown he could handle pressure, even if he couldn't handle subtlety. Frank decided that Vernon needed more responsibility, not less. More involvement, not less. More risk, not less. Frank moved Vernon to Manhattan and made him supervisor of the most important distribution network in the organization. It was a disaster waiting to happen. By 1974, all 5 Lucas brothers were working in Frank's organization. Freddie managed Harlem operations despite his deteriorating mental health. David handled finances despite federal surveillance. Vernon ran Manhattan distribution despite his arrest record. Larry controlled Bronx territory, despite his inexperience. And Frank coordinated everything while watching his family destroy themselves for his empire. The brothers were making more money than they'd ever imagined, but they were also living under constant threat. Rival dealers targeted them. Police investigated them. Federal agents followed them. Their phones were tapped. Their homes were watched. Their friends were interrogated. Worst of all, the brothers were changing. The kind, simple men who'd arrived from Carolina were becoming hard, paranoid, violent. The criminal life was corrupting their souls while enriching their bank accounts. Frank watched his brothers lose their innocence, their peace of mind, their essential humanity. But he couldn't stop. The organization was too big, too profitable, too important. Frank had created something that required his brothers' participation to survive. He'd made them essential to his success and prisoners of his ambition. January 28, 1975. Federal agents surrounded Frank's house in Teaneck. When they arrested Frank, they also arrested Freddie, David, Vernon, and Larry. All 5 Lucas brothers were charged with federal drug conspiracy. All 5 faced life sentences. The family business had become a family catastrophe. During the trial, the prosecution painted the Lucas brothers as a criminal enterprise that had corrupted family bonds for profit. The defense argued that Frank had manipulated his innocent brothers into a life they never chose and didn't understand. Both versions were true. Frank had offered his brothers wealth and success. He'd also condemned them to lives of fear, violence, and imprisonment. He'd loved them enough to want them wealthy. He'd also loved them enough to destroy their lives. Frank eventually cooperated with federal investigators, providing information that led to reduced sentences for himself and his brothers. But cooperation came with its own price. The Lucas family had to enter witness protection, abandoning their identities, their home, their history. Vernon served 8 years in federal prison. Larry served 6. David served 4. Freddie served 3. All of them came out broken men, unable to trust anyone, unable to build normal relationships, unable to escape the trauma of the criminal life that Frank had forced on them. Frank Lucas lived to see his brothers return to Carolina, return to simple lives, return to the innocence he'd stolen from them. But they never forgave him for dragging them into his world. And Frank never forgave himself for loving them enough to destroy them. The family business had made the Lucas brothers millionaires. It had also made them victims. Frank had given his brothers everything they thought they wanted, and in doing so, he'd taken away everything they actually needed: their safety, their peace, their freedom to choose their own lives. Years later, in interviews, Frank would say that involving his brothers was his greatest regret. Not because it led to his arrest, not because it destroyed his empire, but because he'd used his position as older brother to corrupt the people he loved most in the world. I thought I was giving them opportunity, Frank said, but I was really giving them my problems. I thought I was sharing my success, but I was really sharing my sins. I loved my brothers. That's why I brought them in. That's also why I should have kept them out. The Lucas brothers learned something that legitimate businesses understand, but criminal organizations often ignore. Family and business don't mix well. When you involve family in dangerous enterprises, you're not just risking business failure. You're risking the destruction of the people you love most. Frank Lucas built an empire on family loyalty. But he also built a prison from family love. Sometimes the greatest act of love is protection, not inclusion. Sometimes caring about people means keeping them away from your world, not bringing them into it. The family business destroyed the Lucas family. Frank got his brothers involved because he loved them. That love became the weapon that nearly destroyed them all. If this story of family, loyalty, and unintended consequences moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that love without wisdom can become destruction. Share this with someone who knows that protecting the people you care about sometimes means keeping them away from your success. What would you have done if you were Frank Lucas? Let me know in the comments below.